All right, so back to 2020, I went back to being a Marxist leftist because my grandpa confused me again. Like I said, he told me that that white supremacy wasn't the flow, but at the same time, though, this is what I thought. I thought, okay, white supremacy isn't the flow, so you have to be for race mixing, and you have to be for open borders, and you have to be for welfare. Because I thought, okay, if white supremacy is trying to save the self, and the self is an illusion, so I'm like, okay, so then if you're in the flow, you should be opening borders and giving welfare but I didn't realize that was my Jewish. I still saw myself as Jewish, and I just went back to my default, what I always was. And I thought that was the flow, but no, that's not the flow. That's just another formula. And like my grandpa, I should have known, like my grandpa would say, if you're opening borders to be to seem virtuous, that's still self-confirmatory. Or to please God, that's still self-confirmatory. And it might not even lead to more destruction than good. That's why my grandpa would say, if you're not in the flow, it just would lead to suffering. But I didn't understand that at the time. So I'm like, yeah, abortion, the people who are against abortion, they're just Nazis, they're just really white supremacists. So in my mind, I'm like, yeah, so being for abortion, that's more the flow. And oh yeah, and also people who are against promiscuity, who are against porn, that's just because they're white supremacists and they want to make women into baby makers, and they want to, so that they can maintain the white race, and they're just Nazis. So that's self-confirmatory. So they're not in the flow. So in my mind, I'm like, yeah, and the good is bad and the bad is good. So if you're for promiscuity, then you're more in the flow. Because, because even my grandpa said, if you're being bad, then you're more likely to get yourself in trouble, and then you can, whereas a person who's in conformity and being good, he might always stay in conformity but still be stuck in the self and never get in the flow. So I went back to being a leftist, and I was talking bad on Facebook about Sam Hyde, who's a white supremacist, and Jordan Peterson, who's a white supremacist, and Alex Jones, and they're all white supremacists, and all these conservative people. Alex Jones just wants guns because he wants to maintain white supremacy, and I was a Marxist, and I want to get rid of guns so I can, because it's just a way to maintain white supremacy, and I want to get rid of the police because the police are just a way to maintain white supremacy, and, and I would misuse my grandpa's teachings. So my grandpa would say, yeah, it's true. So there's a lot of police officers who express dualistic software, and they're not in the flow. But at the same time, I was expressing dualistic software, being like, yeah, well, we should get rid of police, and we should get rid of the prison system, because the prison system just maintains white supremacy, and it's just dualistic software, and we should just want to rehabilitate people, and the best way to rehabilitate people is to put them in the center of a circle and just tell them that you love them, because really, the people who are the criminals are actually just the victims of society, and they're just reacting to their victimhood. And so I went back to being a white, being a Marxist, leftist, anti-white person. But I thought that I was in the flow. Because in my mind, I'm like, see, I'm transcending the self, but I just went back to it wasn't the transcending the self. I didn't realize I went back to wanting race mixing because I saw myself as Jewish. So I'm like, my grandpa is on my side. And then, but my uncle was online, and my uncle was posting stuff. He was like, the Khazar Jews, they just want, they're funding George Soros, and my uncle's posting all this stuff. And he's texting me all this stuff. He's like, the Khazar Jews, the fucking Khazars, they're fucking funding George Soros and stuff. And in my mind, so I'm posting all my grandpa's or my uncle's posts on Facebook, and I'm being like, yeah, because I'm the victim. I'm like, but the funny thing is, I was the victim, but everything my grandpa was saying was true. I mean, my uncle was saying was true about me. So he's like, the Jews want race mixing pretty much. But I was like, but he wasn't explicitly saying it. But I was saying like, the white supremacists are against George Soros. George Soros just wants to help people. George Soros is more in the flow because he wants to help people and he wants to help minorities. And, my grandpa taught me, he was like, white supremacy, but my grandpa said, black pride is good because the black people always saw themselves as inferior, and seeing yourself as superior is closer to the flow because at least you're not depressed. So I was like, yeah, George Soros is trying to help the people of color, and, but really George Soros wanted race mixing like me. He was a Jewish person who wanted race mixing, and he wanted to destroy the white race. And then this is the other thing that confused me. So like a lot of the QAnon people were against Bill Gates, but I asked my grandpa about Bill Gates, and my grandpa was like, yeah, Bill Gates, I was like, what do you think about him with the GMO food? And my grandpa was like, yeah, Bill Gates with the GMOs, he wants to, he wants to help the world. And, maybe it's a product of oneness consciousness. He wants to feed the whole, he wants to feed the whole world. and it's through the GMOs, and there's a higher aspiration behind that and stuff. So so in my mind, I'm like, the QAnon people, they're against Bill Gates and George Soros, but really they're just white supremacists, and it's just they're right-wing white supremacists. Because I looked online, it said QAnon was an alt-right group, and I saw Christianity as white supremacy, and I saw religion as white supremacy, because I'm like, yeah, the reason why religion exists is just because they want to stop promiscuity of women so they can maintain the white race, and they want to, stop the breaking of laws. But really, laws are just made to maintain white supremacy and maintain the status quo, and there's the criminals are really just the scapegoats of society who are victims of society, and really, so really religion is just white supremacy, and they believe in a separate God, but that's an illusion according to my grandpa, because there is no separation. Everything is one, everything is energy. And so they're still in dualistic software, and they're not really in the flow. So I was basically just went back to being a complete Marxist. And I would misutilize my grandpa's spiritual teachings, thinking that I was using them in the correct way. But really, I was using what my grandpa would say, dualistic software, trying to destroy the white race. But in my mind, I'm like, no, I'm in the flow. I'm in the flow. I thought that I was in the flow, because my grandpa didn't teach me well. He just confused me. So, like, I'll just give one example of that. I always thought, black people tend to get a lot of tattoos, and white people get tattoos maybe so they can show off. It's to say, like, oh, I have a lot of scars, and that attracts mates, and because, some women would be attracted to that because they think, oh, that guy's tough, and that guy can protect me. And my grandpa says dualistic software, right? But, I wanted to be like, yeah, tattoos, they actually are, because my grandpa thought there's a higher aspiration behind aberration. So they're actually, the higher aspiration is that they embellish their bodies because they recognize that they are more than their physical bodies. So, the bad is good and the good is bad. So they're actually closer to the flow, because even though they're confirming the separate self by embellishing it, they're also in the progress of transcending the self. My grandpa taught me the thing that, like, he said, you cannot get there from here, but only those who refuse to accept it will discover that there is here. And the ego is magnificent in its accomplishments, but it's limited in its reach. So, but the idea is, you cannot get to the flow. The self cannot get to the flow, because the self cannot transcend the self. But only those who refuse to accept that, by trying to transcend the self, can you get in the flow. And like one example of that, I think, would be like, the story in the Bible where the two of Aaron's sons. Aaron was a high priest, and two of his sons tried to make a fire that resembled the fire of God, but they ended up being consumed by the fire. But they were still seen as very wonderful people, because at least they tried to build the fire. And the idea is they saw the flow. I think I'm going to ask my grandpa. I think this was an interpretation. They saw the flow through the fire, and they tried to mimic the flow. And they killed them, because you cannot mimic the flow. You cannot create the flow. The self cannot transcend the self. But at least they tried. And as my grandpa said, only those who refuse to accept that there isn't here will discover that there is here. That the flow. So at least they tried to get in the flow. At least, because if you're just like, it's kind of like what's his name? The dude, Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, where he's like, he doesn't want to fight, because he's like, doesn't the spiritual teaching say that fighting is the ego, and shouldn't I just be good? But then Krishna tells Arjuna, because Arjuna is the storm god, and the storm god's always on the side of the god of preservation, whereas the sun god's always on the destruction side, sun is on Shiva's side, and that's why Arjuna, the storm god's fighting Surya, the sun god. But anyways, so Arjuna is like, I shouldn't fight, right? But then Krishna's like, no, you need to fight. That's your duty. And the idea is like, Arjuna's trying to be good, and he's trying to be in the flow, but you can't make the flow happen. And at least by, fighting and getting in the ego, you might, my grandpa would say, you might raise your level of lightness, you might get in the flow. So anyways, but I want to see the good is bad and the bad is good. So, those people, the religious people who are anti-sex, they're not really in the flow. They're actually still in the ego. And actually the people who are promiscuous, they're at least, they're still in the ego. And, the non-promiscuous people, they just want to preserve the white race. That's the Fox News people. They want they want to preserve the family, but that's just because they want to preserve the white race. And they don't realize that, as my grandpa teaches, there is no family, because everything is one. And if you're in the flow, you even transcend the family. But, I didn't realize that if you're in the flow, it doesn't mean that you completely let go of your family. You would still be, within the family structure and everything, and a harmonious family would be a product of the flow and stuff. But again, I didn't understand my grandpa's teachings, and I went back to being a Marxist, seeing myself as Jewish and wanting to destroy the white race. So I'm like, yeah, the Fox News people, that's really Baal worship, because Baal was a fertility god, and really all Fox News wants is the fertility of the white race, and they want to maintain the white race. But in my mind, I'm like, so the key to the transcending the ego would be to race mix, and that would be a sign that you transcended the ego. But really, that's still the ego. There's no formula for the flow, but I didn't realize that, because in my mind, I'm like, the good is bad and the bad is good, so race mix, that's good. And there even is that story where I think his name was Kimri. He ends up having sex with a Moabite at a Baal idol, and there was race mixing. But then he ends up being killed by I forget the guy's name. It's like Peor or something. And then Balaam sees the camp, and then Balaam blesses Israel. And I saw him as like a sacrifice. The sacrifice that saves Israel, kind of like Jesus' sacrifice. There's always that death, the sacrifice that saves them from their sins. But in my mind, I'm like, yeah, at least he was trying to transcend the ego. At least he wasn't just being a goody two-shoes and being, for his race, and which is really self-confirmatory, and he tried to race mix, and that got him in the flow. Yeah, he was killed, but at least he was making an attempt to transcend the self. There's a higher aspiration behind his aberration. But anyways, so I'm trying, seeing myself as Jewish again, I wanted to promote race mixing, and I wanted to promote the destruction of the white race. And so I'm anti-religion again, and I'm thinking that's what my grandpa teaches. But then my uncle's online, and my uncle's like, George Soros and the Khazar Jews are fucking Satanists, and my uncle's typing all this stuff. But I was, again, I'm like, my uncle's just a white supremacist. I'm talking bad about my uncle online. And I feel bad, because then my uncle ended up being run out of Malibu. He was staying at my grandpa's place in Malibu, but there's so many Jews around there. They saw my posts and stuff, and they ran my uncle out of town. And my uncle had to go to Washington to live in Washington, because, I was fucked up. But I thought that I was on the side of God. I thought that being anti-white was on the side of God. I thought that the white man was the devil. And now I realize, actually, Shukracharya and Hinduism was on the side of the Dravidians trying to destroy the Aryan race, trying to destroy the Brahmins, and trying to destroy religion. And that's what I was. I was a Satanist. I was on the side of Shukracharya, on the side of Shiva, against Krishna, against Vishnu. But I didn't know that, because in my mind, I was like, I even was posting this on 90%. I was like, I look highly upon the Nation of Islam, because I saw the black man as like God, because I'm like, the black man, they were traumatized like Jesus was traumatized, and they see themselves as God, but the trauma, they're really just the victims of society, like Jesus was the victims, and they're just been crucified by society. And my grandpa teaches that everything is God and God is energy, so technically the black man is God, and they're the original man. And I wanted to like promote the black man and denigrate the white man, because I wanted race mixing, because I went back to seeing myself as Jewish. And I always saw, like, I remember at that time there was like, what my Jewish friends were posting online, and there was like some white woman, and she said to them like, what this guy was like half Jewish, half Indian and something. He was Hare Krishna, and the white woman was like, if you don't like our country, then get out. And then so he posted her, because he's trying to make her look bad, the evil white Karen. And it's like, dude, the Karens exist for a reason, because the black people and the people of color like me are acting like assholes, But I'm happy about it, because I'm like, yeah, let's destroy the white race, and regardless, so I went back to being a leftist communist, and thinking like the good is bad and the bad is good, and because the bad is actually closer to the flow. And then, as I said, but at the same time, the reason why I was doing this was because I thought that I was appealing to my grandpa. One of the reasons was because I wanted to get my basketball videos when I was younger, and I knew a lot of my friends were black. So I thought, if I appealed to my black friends, then they'll be more likely to get me basketball videos of when I was younger. So I'll be on a leftist and pro-black. The other reason why was because my grandpa wasn't teaching me. And my grandpa didn't like Donald Trump. And I thought, okay, Donald Trump's a white supremacist. So if I become anti-white supremacist like my grandpa, then maybe my grandpa will teach me again. So I became like anti-Donald Trump, anti-race, and anti-racism, pro-race mixing, and, anti-white. And I'm saying like, I was posting like, why is it that the black, because I was posting that the Egyptians were actually white. Studies show that, like, the pharaoh was actually white, and I wanted to see it that way, because I want to be like, you see, the white man is the bad guy, and that's why the Jews destroy the Egyptians, because it's actually the white man. Look, it's the white man who's the bad guy, and the Jews, the victims are the good guys. The Bible's for the victims. I was a Marxist, and I wanted to destroy everything, and destroy the white race, destroy the Aryan race. So And like I said, I was hoping to get my basketball videos when I was younger, and but I thought that I was on my doing what my grandpa taught, and I thought, okay, now because I was kind of a right winger for a little bit, but then I'm like, okay, well maybe this is why my grandpa wasn't teaching me, because I became a right winger for a little bit. So maybe if I become a left winger, then my grandpa will teach me again. But then, as I said, my grandpa was teaching me for a little bit, but then he stopped teaching me. But then my grandma made him teach me again. So he continued to teach me a little bit, but then my grandma died. So I'll get to that part of the story next.